The deadline has been set, and Iran has less than 48 hours to respond. Shockwaves are spreading across the Middle East as the United States delivers an ultimatum that could determine whether this crisis ends in diplomacy or explodes into the most devastating regional conflict in modern history. Washington has just put Tehran on notice. Come to the negotiating table within 2 days, or face military operations that will make the first wave of strikes look like a warning shot. American carrier strike groups are repositioning. Bomber assets are being armed with weapons designed to destroy Iran's most protected facilities, and intelligence agencies are watching for any sign of how Iran will answer. This is not posturing, this is a countdown to war, and the clock is already ticking. The ultimatum was delivered through multiple channels simultaneously approximately 6 hours ago. Swiss diplomats in Tehran, who represent American interests in Iran, received a formal communication from the State Department to be transmitted to Iranian leadership immediately. Back-channel messages went through intelligence intermediaries who have maintained contact between Washington and Tehran even during periods of maximum hostility. The substance was identical across all channels. Iran has 48 hours to commit to negotiations or face escalated military action. But the message contained more than just a deadline. American officials specified exactly what those negotiations must address. Iran must verifiably cease all attacks on American forces, whether conducted directly or through proxy militias. It must end uranium enrichment activities beyond levels permitted under international agreements, and it must provide credible guarantees that its ballistic missile program will not threaten American allies or interests. In exchange, the United States is offering a temporary pause in military operations and willingness to discuss a pathway back to diplomatic engagement. This is where things get serious, because the terms being demanded are ones that Iran has refused to accept for over 5 years. The Islamic Republic spent decades building its nuclear program, missile capabilities, and regional proxy network, specifically to ensure its survival against American pressure. Washington is now demanding Iran dismantle the very foundations of its security strategy, and Iran has less than 2 days to decide whether survival requires compliance or defiance. The strategic calculation behind this ultimatum reveals how dramatically American policy has shifted in the last 72 hours. For decades, the United States pursued a strategy of containment toward Iran. Economic sanctions to pressure the regime, military presence to reassure allies, covert operations to slow nuclear progress, but always stopping short of direct military confrontation that could spiral into wider war. That strategy officially ended when American warplanes struck Iranian territory 3 days ago. Now Washington is pursuing what strategists call coercive diplomacy, using the threat of overwhelming military force to extract concessions that diplomacy alone could never achieve. The theory is straightforward. Iran has just experienced what American air power can do when unleashed. Air defense systems that took decades to build were destroyed in hours. Military infrastructure carefully constructed and hardened was reduced to rubble. If Iran wants to avoid losing everything, it must negotiate. And to ensure Iran takes the threat seriously, American forces are preparing to demonstrate exactly what losing everything would look like. The military preparations underway right now give substance to the ultimatum. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, the most advanced naval formation ever assembled, has moved to a position in the eastern Mediterranean that places Iran's entire western coast within striking range. The Ford carries over 75 aircraft, including F-35C stealth fighters and F-A-18 Super Hornets, equipped with the latest precision weapons. Simultaneously, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Strike Group is operating in the Gulf of Oman, positioned to strike targets along Iran's southern coast and interior. Between these two formations, American naval aviation can reach virtually any target in Iran, but the naval forces are only part of the picture. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers have deployed to an undisclosed location within range of Iranian targets. These aircraft, designed specifically to penetrate the most advanced air defenses and strike the most heavily protected facilities, were held in reserve during the first wave of attacks. Their deployment now sends an unmistakable message. The underground facilities that Iran believes are invulnerable are next. B-52 Stratofortress bombers, capable of carrying massive payloads of precision weapons, have also moved forward. The B-52 is not stealthy. It doesn't need to be. With Iranian air defenses crippled, these aircraft can operate with relative impunity, delivering devastating firepower against targets across the country. And then there are the weapons being prepared. GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator bombs, 30,000-pound bunker busters designed to destroy deeply buried targets, are being loaded onto B-2 bombers. These weapons can penetrate over 200 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating, making even Iran's most protected facilities vulnerable. The message is clear. If Iran refuses to negotiate, the nuclear facilities buried under mountains, the command bunkers hidden beneath Tehran, the missile production plants deep underground, none of them are safe. Understanding why the United States is willing to risk so much on this ultimatum requires understanding what American intelligence believes about Iran's current position. The first wave of strikes did enormous damage, but Iran's offensive capabilities remain largely intact. Ballistic missiles that can strike American bases, proxy forces that can attack throughout the region, the capacity to mine the Strait of Hormuz and disrupt global energy supplies. If the crisis drags on without resolution, Iran will have time to rebuild defensive systems, disperse assets, and prepare for sustained conflict. The window for achieving American objectives through limited military action is closing rapidly. More critically, American intelligence suggests deep divisions within Iranian leadership about how to respond. Hardliners around the supreme leader are arguing for massive retaliation regardless of cost, believing that showing weakness now invites total destruction later. More pragmatic voices recognize that Iran cannot win a military confrontation with the United States and are urging negotiation while Iran still has leverage. The ultimatum is designed to strengthen the pragmatic faction by offering a clear path to de-escalation while simultaneously threatening devastating escalation. Washington is trying to make negotiation the obviously rational choice. But coercive diplomacy carries enormous risks. If Iran interprets the ultimatum as evidence that the United States is determined to destroy the Islamic Republic regardless of Iranian actions, then negotiation appears pointless. Why make concessions that won't prevent American attacks anyway? If hardliners in Tehran successfully frame compliance as capitulation, domestic politics might make it impossible for Iranian leadership to accept the terms even if they recognize the military logic. And if the 48-hour deadline expires without Iranian agreement, the United States faces a terrible choice. Follow through on the threat and trigger wider war, or back down and undermine the credibility of all future American ultimatums. This is high-stakes brinkmanship, and both sides are staring into an abyss. The attack sequence being planned if negotiations fail reveals just how seriously American military commanders are taking this moment. The second wave would begin with strikes against Iran's remaining air defense systems, finishing what the first wave started. Every radar installation, every missile battery, every early warning sensor would be targeted simultaneously. Then would come the underground facilities. Natanz, Fordo, Isfahan, every nuclear-related site would be hit with multiple bunker-penetrating weapons in rapid succession. The goal would not be to slow Iran's nuclear program, but to destroy it entirely, setting Iranian capabilities back by decades. Revolutionary Guard command centers would be next, the hardened bunkers from which Iran coordinates its regional proxy network, the facilities where Quds Force commanders plan operations, the communications nodes that link Tehran to militias across the Middle East, all of them would be targeted in a single night of overwhelming violence. Then the missile production facilities, the aerospace research centers, the weapons depots, every element of Iran's offensive military-industrial complex would be struck in a campaign designed to eliminate Iran's ability to threaten American forces or allies for years to come. Military planners are calling it the decapitation scenario. Not regime change, but the destruction of every military capability that makes the Islamic Republic a regional power. The human cost would be staggering. Even with precision weapons, operations on this scale would inevitably cause significant casualties. Iranian military personnel, workers at industrial facilities, civilians living near targeted sites. And that says nothing of the retaliatory strikes Iran would almost certainly launch before its capabilities were completely destroyed. But here's what most people don't know. The ultimatum contains a secret component that has not been made public. American officials have communicated privately to Iranian leadership that if negotiations begin within the 48-hour window, the United States is prepared to discuss not just a pause in military operations, but a broader framework for reducing tensions, potential relaxation of some economic sanctions, recognition of legitimate Iranian security concerns, even possible acknowledgement that Iran has regional interests that the United States can accommodate. This offer goes far beyond what American officials are saying publicly. It's designed to give Iranian leadership a way to frame negotiations not as capitulation but as successful resistance that forced American concessions. Whether Iran accepts this framing or rejects it as insulting will determine whether diplomacy has any chance of success. And what happened next changed everything. Approximately 3 hours ago, Iranian state television broadcast an address by President Raisi. The speech was defiant, condemning American aggression and promising that the Iranian people would never surrender to threats. But buried in the rhetoric was a single sentence that intelligence analysts are parsing for meaning. Iran has always been willing to engage in dialogue based on mutual respect and recognition of sovereign rights. It's not an acceptance of the ultimatum. But it's not an outright rejection either. American officials are now engaged in frantic analysis. Is this Iranian leadership signaling willingness to negotiate while maintaining domestic credibility? Or is it simply rhetorical cover for preparing military retaliation? The next 24 hours will provide the answer, because Iran is simultaneously making military preparations that suggest readiness for conflict. Ballistic missile units remain dispersed and ready. Proxy forces across the region are on heightened alert. Naval assets are positioning in ways that suggest preparation for operations in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is keeping its options open, and that ambiguity is exactly what makes this moment so dangerous. Global reaction to the American ultimatum has been swift and divided. Israel's government issued a statement of strong support, praising American resolve and pledging full cooperation with any military operations deemed necessary. Israeli officials have made clear they view Iranian nuclear capabilities as an existential threat that justifies any action to eliminate. But European allies are expressing deep concern. France, Germany, and the United Kingdom issued a joint statement calling for immediate de-escalation and warning against actions that could destabilize the entire region. European leaders fear being dragged into a conflict they want no part of. Russia condemned the ultimatum as international blackmail and called for an emergency UN Security Council meeting. But notably, Moscow has not threatened any concrete action to support Iran. Russian rhetoric is far stronger than Russian commitment. China's response has been more measured. Beijing called for dialogue while expressing concern about unilateral military action. But Chinese officials also quietly communicated to Tehran through diplomatic channels that China cannot provide material support if Iran chooses confrontation over negotiation. Iran is discovering that its international support is rhetorical rather than substantive. Regional reactions reveal the deep divisions across the Middle East. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have privately expressed support for American pressure on Iran, though public statements remain carefully neutral. Gulf Arab states view Iranian power as a direct threat and welcome anything that reduces it. Iraq's government is paralyzed. Baghdad depends on American military support, but also maintains close ties with Tehran. Iraqi officials are desperately trying to position themselves as mediators, while privately hoping the crisis resolves without forcing them to choose sides. Qatar, which maintains relations with both Washington and Tehran, has offered to host negotiations if both parties agree. It's a genuine offer, but also a calculated move to enhance Qatar's regional influence by positioning itself as the indispensable mediator. And energy markets are in chaos. Oil prices spiked to $160 per barrel on news of the ultimatum before pulling back slightly. But volatility remains extreme. Every rumor, every unconfirmed report, every hint about Iranian intentions sends prices swinging wildly. Global economic consequences are mounting. Airlines are raising ticket prices to account for higher fuel costs. Manufacturing dependent on petroleum-based inputs is seeing costs surge. Inflation, already politically toxic across Western democracies, is accelerating. The economic pressure may ultimately force diplomatic resolution, even if military logic suggests otherwise. So what happens next? Scenario 1. Iran accepts the ultimatum and negotiations begin. This doesn't mean the crisis ends immediately. Talks would be contentious, with both sides trying to maximize their position. Iran would seek to preserve as much of its program as possible. The United States would demand verifiable limitations. But if negotiations actually commence, the immediate risk of wider war recedes. Both sides would have incentive to avoid provocations that could derail talks. A fragile process toward de-escalation could begin. Scenario 2. Iran rejects the ultimatum and the United States launches the second wave of strikes. This scenario leads almost inevitably to wider conflict. Iran would retaliate with everything available. Proxy forces would attack American personnel across the region. Ballistic missiles would target bases and potentially civilian infrastructure in allied states. Israel could be drawn in if Hezbollah launches attacks on Israeli cities. Gulf Arab states might face strikes against their energy infrastructure. The entire Middle East could be at war within days. Scenario 3. Iran neither accepts nor rejects, but continues the current ambiguity. This is perhaps the most dangerous scenario because it leaves both sides uncertain about the other's intentions. American military pressure would continue to build. Iranian defensive preparations would intensify, and the risk of miscalculation, of someone making a mistake that triggers the war nobody wants, would remain catastrophically high. The fundamental dynamics that have driven this crisis have not changed. American determination to prevent Iranian nuclear capabilities and attacks on American forces. Iranian determination to resist American pressure and maintain its regional position. What has changed is the timeline. The 48-hour deadline imposes a forcing function that might break the stalemate one way or another. And that brings us to the deeper geopolitical forces at work. This crisis is about more than just the United States and Iran. It's about the future of American power in the Middle East and whether regional actors believe American security commitments are credible. For years, allies and adversaries alike have wondered whether the United States would actually use military force to defend its interests, or if decades of inconclusive conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan had permanently undermined American will. The strikes against Iran answer that question definitively. American power, when unleashed, remains unmatched. But the ultimatum poses a different question. Can the United States translate military dominance into diplomatic outcomes? If coercive diplomacy works and Iran negotiates, it validates an approach to power that combines overwhelming force with diplomatic flexibility. Other potential adversaries would note that challenging American interests leads to devastating consequences, but that accommodation is rewarded. If coercive diplomacy fails and the crisis spirals into wider war, it suggests that American power can destroy but cannot compel. That military dominance is insufficient to achieve political objectives without massive, sustained commitment that American society may not support. China is watching this crisis with particular attention. Beijing is drawing lessons about American resolve, military capability, and willingness to accept costs in defense of strategic interests. Those lessons will inform Chinese calculations about Taiwan, the South China Sea, and the broader competition for influence in the Indo-Pacific. Russia is watching to see whether the international order can constrain American power or whether Washington can act unilaterally when it deems interests sufficiently vital. And every other nation with contested relationships with the United States is recalibrating its assessment of what's possible and what's permissible. The Middle East crisis is a window into the fundamental tensions of international politics in the 21st century. Right now in Tehran, Iranian leaders are meeting to decide how to respond to the American ultimatum. The discussions are intense, probably angry, definitely consequential. Some are arguing for defiance, that the Islamic Republic cannot survive if it bows to American threats. That negotiation under duress is capitulation. That Iranian credibility requires standing firm, regardless of cost. Others are making the case for pragmatism, that Iran cannot win a military confrontation with the United States, that preserving the regime requires tactical flexibility, that living to fight another day is better than glorious destruction. The decision they reach will be made based on incomplete information, under enormous pressure, with stakes that couldn't be higher. And in Washington, American officials are similarly divided. Hawks argue that this is the moment to finish what was started, that Iran will never be weaker or more vulnerable, that eliminating the Iranian threat once and for all serves long-term American interests, even at significant short-term cost. Doves warn that wider war would be catastrophic, that the economic consequences alone could trigger global recession, that no military victory can solve the underlying political dynamics that create conflict in the first place. The president must weigh these competing arguments and decide what happens if the deadline expires without Iranian acceptance. These are the burdens of power, the terrible responsibility of making decisions that will echo for decades, affecting millions of lives based on imperfect information in moments of crisis. And the truth is, nobody knows the right answer. History will judge these decisions, but history offers no guarantee that the judgments will be fair or even accurate. We only know that decisions are being made, that the 48-hour clock is counting down, and that when it reaches zero, the world will be different than it is right now. The fragility of global order has never been more apparent. The thin margin between stability and chaos, the narrow space between crisis and catastrophe. For decades, we've lived in a world where major powers avoided direct military confrontation, where tensions were managed, crises were contained, and escalation was carefully controlled. That world is being tested right now. The ultimatum to Iran is not just about Iranian nuclear programs or attacks on American forces. It's a test of whether the rules-based international order can survive when one party believes its vital interests are threatened, and the answer to that test will shape international politics for a generation. Less than 42 hours remain. Iran must choose between negotiation and confrontation. The United States must prepare for either outcome, and the world must wait to see which path is chosen. This is the reality we live in, where the decisions of a few determine the fate of millions, where the space between war and peace is measured in hours, where the future hangs in the balance of choices made by fallible humans under impossible pressure. The countdown continues, and when it ends, we'll all discover together what comes next.